Our next presenter will be Chad Moore. He's the Transport Field Specialist for USDA, and today he'll be talking about the changing landscape for ground transportation. All of you welcome Chad.
Thank you. Is this on? Yes, it is. All right. Thank you. How's everybody doing? Thank you, Shannon. So, take a look at that snazzy advertisement. It's about a 90-year-old magazine ad. And, you know, things have drastically changed in the way that animals are transported and within the animal transport industry since that time, as evidenced by this article. So we have improved technology. We've talked about that with marine mammals and their use to this point. We have increased knowledge through all the practices and all the time spent in evaluating the animals during their transports. But also, you could say that things have changed even drastically just over the past few years. So when we look at this ad, just for reference again, it says that the dog rides comfortably in a sack, you know, on the side of the car, and the bag is versatile. It could be removed and attached to the car in a fairly easy manner. I don't know how many of you would transport your dog on something like that. I don't know, maybe the dog would enjoy it. But thankfully, things do change, and thankfully, there's progression. So, we go over a little bit of the history, present, and just outlook in the future of the Animal Welfare Act. Several points have already been touched on by the speakers that have already come before myself. But the origin of the Animal Welfare Act and came from Pepper. I don't know how many people are familiar with Pepper, the Dalmatian? A couple people, okay. All right. So for those of you that don't know, Pepper was a Dalmatian that was taken from her farm in Pennsylvania by a dog dealer who would take animals and then turn and sell them into research. The owner recognized Pepper after searching for her in a newspaper article with a photo of Pepper in the dog dealer's truck. And so he contacted the dog dealer rather, and his wife and children went and attempted to retrieve Pepper, but they were not allowed onto the dog dealer's premises. So they contacted their representative, and the representative also attempted to go and access the premise, but they were also denied. And ultimately, Pepper was sold to a research hospital in New York State and was euthanized after she had an experiment conducted. So in finding that out, the representative went back to Congress and helped to champion the Laboratory Animal Welfare Act as it was originally known. And that came through with provisions for dogs, including identification, ID requirements, acquisition and disposition records for the animals or for the dogs and cats, and also required dog dealers to be licensed and research facilities to be registered. So today marks the anniversary that the Animal Welfare Act, Laboratory Animal Welfare Act, was signed into law in 1966. It was on August 24th. Right? It's a good thing. Absolutely. Absolutely. So in 1970, the Animal Welfare Act was amended. And in that amendment, it did become officially the Animal Welfare Act instead of the Laboratory Animal Welfare Act. As Bob pointed out earlier, it then covered most warm-blooded mammals under that. All right, the 1976 amendment. That was a pretty big one. as we talked about and we've mentioned several times. It further defined what a carrier and intermediate handler are. And a carrier is any business, railroad, airline, et cetera, that operates on a for-hire business to transport animals. An intermediate handler is a person or a government entity that takes possession of an animal that takes possession, that's in a business that takes possession of an animal in conjunction with their transport. The 1976 amendment also introduced the requirement to obtain health certificates for dogs and cats, and it required intermediate handlers and carriers to also maintain those health certificates as well. And this was in addition to COD requirements. So 1979, then we had marine mammals come onto the scene. And, Dr. Dold did a wonderful job of illustrating all of the things that are done on a marine mammal transport. When these regulations first came out in 1979, I'm sure there was quite a gap in knowledge and technology that is in use today. So we've already heard, right? USDA is covering birds as of this year. Everybody get excited. So the Animal Welfare Act did add standards for birds in 2023. So as Bob indicated, facilities with existing licenses and registrations are now required to follow the regulations and standards for birds as of Monday, which was the 21st of August. So this, every single industry that we regulate transports animals. And those that transport birds, of course, we're coming, into that as well. So this is going to be, new not only for you folks that we inspect, but for us inspecting the birds as well. But there's some great resources out there. Dr. Cody Yeager and company have spent a lot of time and developed materials that really have helped things out. So bird transports that occur under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act are not covered under the Animal Welfare Act. They just want to add that in. And then finally, previously unlicensed and unregistered facilities that do exhibit, breed, broker, or transport birds under covered activity must be licensed or registered and must be in compliance by February 21st of next year. All right. So again, we talked about transportation of animals. It occurs at every single entity that we regulate, right? So we're talking about pets, we're talking about zoo animals, we're talking about research facilities, and we're also talking about registrants that do transport these animals as well. So where that's just their primary function. So we know that everybody transports animals. What we really don't know, well, we do know, but who are the people, who are the entities, licensees and registrants? Because they're not the same. So some of you may know this material already, but just to go through, like I said, there are differences between license holders and registrants. There are 3 different license types. There are A licenses. These are the breeders and sellers of animals that are born on their premise. I'm sorry, the animals are bred and born on their premise, and they sell to either a wholesaler or to the owner. These individuals or these license holders will transport their own animals, or they will hire a transporter, a registered transporter rather, to deliver their animals to the final pet owner. Facilities with Class B licenses, they purchase and resell covered animals, and they may also have animals that are bred and sell animals that are bred and born on their premises. And they can do that as a small portion of their business. Some examples can include dog brokers, small animal wholesale pet distributors, and that sell covered animals to pet store. And then finally, the last license type are C license, which are exhibitors. Typically we see these, I know a lot of you folks, come from the zoological community. There are other exhibitors of animals to the public that provide educational shows or bring animals to birthday parties. Those are C license holders as well. And the C license holders, again, can exhibit or can transport their own animals. All right, so when we talk about transport inspections of licensees, they're not necessarily the same from an inspector's point of view in what you see at registrants. So during inspections at licensed entities, for example, a zoo, an inspector is going through and they are evaluating several things. They're evaluating the animals, they're evaluating the enclosures, they're evaluating barriers, they're evaluating diet storage, they're evaluating sanitation. They are going through and looking at written programs of veterinary care. They're looking at contingency plans. As Dr. Dolder mentioned earlier, there are individual plans for the contingency plans oftentimes in that community for the transport of animals. Also, there may be other documentation that they're looking at, but so the transport inspections are part of the larger facility inspection. So the transport section of the inspection may include animal holding facilities. They may include transport vehicles and transport enclosures and records. That's not, or that's pretty typical when we conduct zoo inspections. So next, we have registrants. And again, registrants are, and for the purposes of talking about ground transport, they're carriers and intermediate handlers, but typically we're seeing pet ground transporters. These are the folks that you can hire to transport your pet from point A to point B. Of course, there are also airlines and air transport. With an intermediate handler or an H registration, again, that is a person or a government entity that is engaged in any business where they receive custody of or possession of an animal in connection with their transport and commerce. Okay, so what do registrant transport inspections look like? So during those inspections, again, we're talking about non-airport associated ground transporters. So these aren't the inspections at the airports, but so they look pretty different. So as an inspector evaluating things on the inspection, it's not part of a larger inspection. This is solely what they're looking at. They're looking at, well, to start with, they're typically going to a person's home. They're not going to a facility or a business. Sometimes they do, but they're going there. They are evaluating records such as contingency plans, house certificates if they have them. They are maybe looking at animal enclosures, transport enclosures. Not all registered transporters have animal enclosures. Oftentimes they'll require the individuals who have the pets to purchase them or to provide them at the time of delivery for transport. So they're not required to have those enclosures on hand and in place. Also, vehicles may be inspected, but there are some instances where ground transporters don't even have vehicles. That don't use their own vehicles, and they rent vehicles every time they go to transport an animal. So An inspector may go to one of these facilities and just be looking at records and not have anything else. So it's quite a different experience. All right, so in recent years, especially, and more specifically, since the pandemic, USDA has seen a significant rise in new ground transport registrations, a very significant rise. And this is due to multiple things. Several people purchased or adopted animals during this time, especially dogs. There were fewer options for air travel, decreased routes from many airlines due to availability of pilots and flight staff. And so ground transport really became, it really rocketed. And so during that time, also, the public also became aware of virtual platforms that offered ground transport for animals because there was a need there as well. And so when we talk about the number of new ground transport registrations from February of 2020, roughly the beginning of the pandemic, until today, we've seen approximately 7,500 new registrations. And these are just ground transporters. These are non-airport associated ground transporters. That's a lot. You see the numbers in February of 2020 and in January of 2017, the numbers were fairly consistent between 500 and 550, but we've had a lot of new people. Part of the other trends, some of the other trends that we've seen, and this has been touched on, God bless you, are the influx of dogs that are being imported into the country and dog movements in and out of animal shelters just within the country, from shelters, typically in the south up into shelters in the north. And so Emily, I'm gonna just pick on you a little bit. I thought I saw you earlier. CDC, and I can't cite the exact CDC article, estimated that 1 million dogs are imported into the country every year. 1 million. That's huge. And there's not any one agency that tracks every single import into the country or every single animal into the country, but I suspect CDC has some pretty good numbers, and we'll hear some more great stuff about that tomorrow during Dr. Baracci's talk. So USDA live dog import, their program just in the last few years, since 2020, has seen significant increases in requests for permits and also just in their issuance of permits as well. So since October of 2020, Animal Care Live Dog Import has issued over 10,000 live dog import permits for 42,000 dogs. That's just, again, since October of 2020. So, and again, in the last probably 5 or 6 years that I've saw it, and I can't cite a metric for that, when the exact time was, there's been a substantial movement of dogs, again, from shelters and humane societies from the southern part of the country to the northern part. So we've had a lot of animals that have been transported in recent years. So just as I said, with all these new animal transports that we have, when things aren't done correctly, things can go wrong. And we've seen, and Animal Care has received complaints, increased complaints of accidents in animal incidents, escapes, and things like that just during this time period. And it makes sense, again, when you think about it, with all of these animals being transported in just that period of time. Here's some of the headlines that we see that just, are relatively easy to find. And again, not that the people are doing anything bad, but it just illustrates that there are a lot of animal transports. So Dr. Keller talked earlier about the Omnibus Appropriations Act, and Congress, or I'm sorry, the committee asked APHIS to review the licensing and registration processes that may lead to a lack of oversight between license holders and registrants. They were also concerned that the USDA is not able to deny or to terminate any registration. And so they asked us to take a look at the processes and take any available administrative actions to address the issues, and then to send Congress recommendations for any additional legislative steps. So when we talked about carriers, or I'm sorry, licensees and registrants, here are, again, they're not the same. Here are the differences between the two. Licensees must pay an application fee, as applicants must pay an application fee of $120, and then must be contacted by an inspector who will go through their facility, their animals. They will talk to them about how what their business plan is, how the facility is set up, and essentially go through all the regulations and standards by phone during a pre-licensed phone call. So there's also a requirement to demonstrate compliance, and that comes in the form of pre-license inspections. These applicants get up to 3 inspections to come into compliance in order to become licensed. Otherwise, they just simply don't get a license. The same is true for maintaining their license. They must, after 3 years, their license expires. It is not good indefinitely. It is not issued indefinitely. So they must go through the same process of demonstrating compliance, again, using up to 3 inspections if need be. And licenses can be denied. So that is, when we see problematic things, when an individual or a business, an individual has been convicted of animal cruelty, let's say, their license can be, their license will be evaluated to see if it can be denied on that basis. Licensees, regularly inspected. I'm not gonna say how often we inspect, licensees, or how often we inspect registrants. And unfortunately, I wanted to, with the previous numbers, I wanted to provide you with the number of inspectors that we've had during those time points. I don't know those exact numbers, but they've been relatively consistent. We might have a few more inspectors now. Again, talked about that licenses can be suspended or revoked, and there can be civil penalties issued depending on the severity of what's found during inspections. And so when we go over to registrants, here's the difference. There's no fee. You can get online and apply for a license and just email it to the USDA Animal Care mailbox. There's no educational component. An inspector is not going to contact the registrant applicant. So, and also, they're not required to demonstrate compliance. They're not required to have those pre-registration inspections like the pre-license inspections go, or to be re-registered at any point. They just have to update their registration every few years. Registrations can't be denied. So anybody can apply for a registration and they'll likely be given a registration. Registrants cannot be suspended and they cannot be revoked. So, but they can incur civil penalties. And so I want to be really clear that animal care does take action when there are issues with animals, but the Animal Welfare Act does not currently provide any method to suspend or revoke registrations. If you're registered, you're registered. All right, so I just wanted to highlight a couple of different transportation regulations. This is obviously not the Animal Welfare Act, but we're talking about animal welfare here during transport, and it's such an important thing. It is such a stressful event. Even when everything goes right, it is stressful. I joke, and when I say I joke, a dog and cat just traveling to an airport with its owner that it's familiar with. Maybe they ride in their owner's vehicle. Maybe the owner's taken steps to acclimate the animal a little bit to the enclosure. Maybe they haven't. It's a stressful event, right? Because where are we going? What are we doing? You end up at a cargo facility, let's say at an airline. It's different smells. It's a different environment. It's different sounds. And even when everything is done right, it's extremely stressful. And I always joke and say, if it's a cat, it's the most stressful experience that animal's ever had, hands down. So again, back to the 28-hour law. And I just, like I said, just wanted to highlight that. I do not know the ins and outs of both of these laws, but just to some of the highlights during transport, I thought was really interesting because it's definitely to the benefit of animal welfare. So the 28-hour law it was enacted back in 1873. The most recent version came in 1906. And the law states that that a carrier transporting animals interstate may not confine animals in a vehicle or vessel for more than 28 consecutive hours without unloading the animals for feeding, water, and rest. So if that time, that doesn't exist in the Animal Welfare Act. And so I thought, again, highlighting animal welfare that's, in transit times, that's absolutely a fantastic thing. So again, if the animals are transported for 28 consecutive hours, they must be unloaded in a humane manner, and they must be put into pens with feed and water and allowed to rest for 5 hours. So that's huge. That's pretty substantial. So there are some exceptions to the law. I'm not going to get into those because I really like what I just said and what we talked about, welfare. Welfare is good. Then we have the European Commission, January of 2005, and I'm sure there are some of you that are more familiar than I with this. I am an Animal Welfare Act SME, but again, some of the provisions in that, and that is, those laws are for all EU members that transport animals through any of their states. They do have specific time periods, again, and again, I think this comes in with livestock. It sticks out in my mind. I know, Dr. Keller, you said we weren't going to talk about livestock, but I'm going to bring up livestock a little bit. But there are some time periods where livestock are allowed to travel, and they either have to be accompanied with food and water to lengthen that period of time that they're transported, or they have to unload them, and it breaks it down even more into the age of the animal, talking about juvenile animals and even livestock, juvenile animals versus adult animals, and making sure that they have rest periods and that they have adequate food and they have adequate water and all of those kind of good things. All right. All right. So the future of animal welfare or animal transportation or the future of animal transport welfare. So, you know what? It makes me really hopeful when I look out at everybody gathered in this room and everybody who's watching virtually that has tuned in because of this topic, because this is a very serious topic. Again, it affects every industry that we regulate. So looking at it from just a few different perspectives, and again, I apologize because already a couple of the speakers have stolen my thunder. But animal care is examining the contingency rules impact on transportation. To all of our stakeholders, you should expect to see something in the way of a study, and it is, hopefully give your honest feedback, and this will be very beneficial to the animals' transport welfare. As Dr. Kellen mentioned earlier, animal care has taken transport very seriously as a topic. And so they have created both my position and Dr. Fitzhugh's position, and that is huge. I will tell you, as an inspector for over 21 years prior to coming on as the transport field specialist, transport was always a priority for animal care, but that priority had multiple priorities on top of it. And so there has absolutely been a change and a focus to make sure that we're getting this right. And I am going to put us a little ahead, apparently. Does anybody have questions?
All right, so just a reminder, if you have a question in person, raise your hand. And if you are virtual, please put it in the Q&A. All right, first question.
Hi, my name is Lisa. Also an IPOTA member, work with Across the Pond Pets. When you were mentioning and I should read it, so I'm sorry if I haven't read it yet, but the birds you said was not going to apply to migratory birds. Is that going to apply to birds of prey?
I believe that depends on the activity. It's not the birds itself, but it depends on the activity. So falconry, my understanding is that falconry is exempt. Dr. Yeager, can you confirm that?
So it's birds covered under the Migratory Treaty Act, and it's for rehab if they're going to the wild or going into rehab facilities, okay? That's what that transportation is not covered. That's what Chad's referring to, okay? So if you're taking a raptor that's covered under that and releasing it to the wild, that transportation would not be covered. But if you're taking it into a rehab facility and going to be exhibiting that bird, that would be covered. But we're talking about the transportation, Chad, as we're talking about.
Okay, so what about shipping a falcon from Seattle? Sorry. If I'm shipping a falcon from Seattle to the Dubai Falcon Club, and they're going to be using it for racing and hunting.
It's for falconry purposes?
Mhm.
Yeah, then it's not covered.
Not covered. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Yeager.
Karen, do we have a question?
Yes. Are there plans to amend the regs to require compliance and to have the ability to deny, suspend, terminate, and revoke registrants, or to require licensure for the intermediate handlers, particularly given the spike in registrants?
Are there plans? Not that I'm aware of at this time. Do I want that to happen? I think that, again, I think that several people, if not all, would like to see improvements to the welfare of animals anytime that can be taken.
Okay, next question.
I think what we're facing a lot today is the biggest stressor on animals being shipped by ground is time and the amount of time they spend in the vehicle. Over the last few years, that seems to have become an increased stressor as different laws outside of USDA regs have required limitations on over-the-road drivers' time on the road. Is there anything you're looking at as a way to address that and to try and expedite the actual movement of the animals?
That's a great question. So again, currently, as you pointed out, and as I mentioned earlier, there are no in-transit time limits in the Animal Welfare Act or in the standards. As far as that is definitely something that is on the radar as an issue, as an animal welfare issue. I can't, there are not plans currently in motion that I'm aware of. So I do want to make that really clear. But again, that is definitely a welfare concern. And that's something that that's absolutely on our radar.
Karen, do we have another question?
Yes. What about birds held by zoos who are covered under MBTA? Are these also not covered?
Could you please repeat that, Karen?
What about birds held by zoos who are covered under MBTA? Are these also not covered?
So the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, Dr. Yeager, could I have you weigh in on that
Yeah,
again?
they're covered. They're being exhibited, right? So those would be covered. We're talking about transportation, right? They wouldn't be covered if they're for their conservation efforts. But if they're being exhibited at a zoo, yes, they would be covered.
If they're being moved from zoo to zoo, yeah, as
Yes,
well?
that would still be covered. Yes, we're talking about for like from the wild or to the facility.
Thank you, Dr. Yeager.
Okay, do we have any other in-person questions? Karen, do you have any other questions? Okay, we still have quite a few minutes here. Does anyone have any transportation bird questions that Dr. Yeager could answer before the Q&A session or later today?
Sorry. Just so I do a lot of falcons, so I just want to make sure I understand it correctly. 9 times out of 10, they're going from a falconer here in the US to a private owner in Dubai or Doha. And then they're going to use them for a racing event. That's not exhibition? It doesn't apply?
Nope. You're not exhibiting it to the public, right?
Well, the races are public. I mean, they're big events over there.
Just like pigeon racing and all that, like dog racing,
Okay.
that's not covered by us.
And I
Oh,
want to clarify too, you're talking about them racing over in Dubai, not here, correct?
correct.
So that would not be covered activity from an exhibition standpoint because we don't have jurisdiction in Dubai.
I was just curious because I'm transporting them from the
Gotcha.
Falconer to the airport and the purpose of their travel. So I was just trying to make sure I'm looping everything together right.
Yeah, no, that would not be covered.
Sweet. Okay.
Great.
Karen, do we have any other questions?
Just one last one. Any information on the transportation of bees?
Karen, could you repeat that? Any information on the transportation what?
Bees. Like a bumblebee.
Of bees? Oh, okay. So bees are not covered under the Animal Welfare Act. Bee transport may be covered under another division of USDA or an APHIS actually. Dr. Keller may have knowledge of that. I don't know any further information about that. APQ, okay. Plant protection, USDA APHIS plant protection and quarantine.
All right, perfect. Next question.
I just have a question about I know there's concern about the hybrid institutions that are AZA accredited may also have a rehab license for migratory birds. Do you have to keep those records separate? So you may be doing migratory bird rehab activity, and you may keep some of those birds, and they may become exhibit animals, and you may transport them as exhibit animals. And then you may have accepted animals from rehabbers that are non-releasable, and they are part of your exhibit collection or education collection. Do those records have to be kept separate so that you can report them as separate activity?
Is this on? Okay. If you're doing both though activities, you're going to be covered though. I mean, this is for, it has to be solely one or the other. So if you're doing mixed, then you're going to be doing, we're going to look at everything. Okay. It's only if you're solely doing, the migratory bird. Okay. So if you're doing both, you're going to look at everything. And then, so it's keeping it separate. And then we just, for when we're looking at the, for paperwork, we're going to be looking at everything, but you're only required for those covered birds. So, but we'll be looking at all the birds there if they're going to be all together. Okay.
Okay, Karen, do you have another question?
Yes. What are the requirements for transporting working dogs for government agencies like DHS domestically and internationally? Should the general transportation standards for dogs be used?
Again, Karen, I'm sorry, could you read that last sentence again?
Should the general transportation standards for dogs be used?
For
Did-
dogs?
Did you need the whole thing read? Working dogs. What are the requirements for transporting working dogs for government agencies like DHS domestically and internationally? Should the general transportation standards for dogs be used?
Right, so I apologize, I thought you said dolphins. I was very confused. All right, so other federal agencies and entities are not covered to my knowledge, and I apologize because I don't know the answer to that question. Can anybody confirm that that is the case? Dr. Fitzhugh.
So I used to be a veterinarian in the Army Veterinary Corps, and we were required to have health certificates. So that is one of the requirements in the Animal Welfare Act, is that if the animal is owned by a government, a federal, state, or other government entity, that animal must be transported and have a health certificate issued within 10 days before their transport. And absolutely, the dogs also were required to comply with the Animal Welfare Act, the Code of Federal Regulations. So there is some gray areas to what does USDA require of other federal agencies, but internally, most of the Department of Defense and Homeland Security, they use the Animal Welfare Act standards to transport their animals.
Thank you, Dr. Fitzhugh.
And last question.
So I just want to clarify something about the Falcon that you're saying goes to Dubai. But the airlines came under us this week as far as birds. So I would still label that container as if it was any other bird. Make sure it has those labels, make sure you're complying with IATA standards, because the airline may refuse and you don't want to go all the way and have that set up. And then they're going to get there and say, well, we're afraid to ship it like this. So, yeah.
We said that we said photos of all the crates and everything, pre-notified and check 40 hours in advance.
Thanks, Bob.
All right, if everyone could thank Chad.